Understanding Sociology, Chapter 1. Let's get started. Understanding Sociology, Chapter 1. Sociology is the scientific study of social behavior and human groups. Sociology strives to focus on social relationships on various levels in society. We will talk about the micro, meso, macro, and global level that sociology studies interactions on. Sociology also focuses on how social relationships influence people's behavior, both individuals of people, groups of people, entire societies and nation states of people. And sociology also studies how societies develop and change, how social movements are formed, pretty much how society has been evolving for centuries. C. Wright Mills also discusses the sociological imagination. The sociological imagination is having the awareness of the relationship between the individual, the single person, and wider society. And it's having the ability to view your own society as an outsider would. So being able to take yourself out of your current cultural view and step outside that comfort zone, all of that knowledge, and be able to objectively analyze your own culture and society. The sociological imagination, if you can do that, if you can remove yourself from where you are within your own society, it allows you to go beyond just those personal experiences and observations and really take a more objective look at society. And that's what sociology strives to do. It strives to be and is an objective social science. So let's talk about how sociology is a social science. Sociology as a social science. So throughout your formal education, here either in the United States or some of you may have been educated abroad, we're very versed in what a hard science is, a natural science. A natural science studies the physical features of nature, the way they interact and change, so the physical states of matter. How does matter, how does water go from a solid and a liquid to a gas, right? These are all clearly observable changes within the state of water, and we know certain hard facts about it will freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's an example of a hard science, a natural science, very concrete, very fact-based. Sociology, on the other hand, is one of the social sciences. Social sciences include political science, economics, psychology. The social sciences study the social features of humans and the way they interact and change. Social sciences are newer in the realm of research, not brand new. Both natural sciences and social sciences are constantly making new theories and discoveries. But as a social science, it focuses on theories of how people's behaviors interact, the way they change, and can we replicate and then extrapolate the data we collect as social scientists to solving other larger issues. So sociologists study the influence society has on individual and groups' attitudes and behavior. Sociologists seek to understand the ways in which those attitudes and behaviors shape society in return. Sociologists also study things like global recessions and how the recession impacts the social relationships. Sociologists also look to study the mass shootings that seem to be a new social phenomenon. There's a sociologist now who is theorizing that are these types of mass shootings a new type of protest? And as outrageous as that may seem, sociologists are starting to systematically look at the factors surrounding these mass shootings and see if they can theorize and then test these types of attitudes and social behaviors. I will try to find the article and I will send you all the link to that because it is very interesting, cutting edge sociological research. The other thing we have to differentiate with sociology as a social science is how sociology is then different from what we commonly refer to as common sense. Common sense is what we, and when I say we, I mean each individual culture determines common sense to be the conventional wisdom. What do we commonly all take to be known as true? Now, we can do that because we have, as a society, the collective we has a similar belief system and a similar language and culture, so therefore common sense can be understood. What sociologists will point out is that common sense is often fallible and it is often inaccurate. So sociologists strive to make concrete and accurate, systematic, scientific observations about social behavior, whereas common sense can often be based upon a few chance observations that don't necessarily hold true. The development of sociology. Prior to the 19th century, so prior to really the 1800s, most human behavior was described by philosophers and religious authorities, pretty much stating observations about human behavior. Now, if we think about the religious authority, depending on which religion, but a religious authority listing and observing human behavior, much of human behavior was dictated by a person's rituals in their religion. So it wasn't that these early human observations about interactions and relationships were not part of the scientific study of them. But around the 1800s, the 19th century, European theorists that we're going to talk about on the next slide were making huge early contributions to the development of really looking at human behavior and looking at it from a scientific standpoint. So early and later sociological thinkers here. This is kind of the slide of faces. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, sociology as a social science really began to come into its own in the late 1800s and moving forwards. So giving it a historical perspective, this is really the time in the United States, much of Europe, that societies are undergoing a lot of change pretty quickly. This is really the time of the Industrial Revolution. There's new technology being created, really shifts in larger agrarian societies to a more industrial urban area. So it's not necessarily surprising that the study of these human behaviors and relationships and social structures really starts to take shape as this impetus of change is happening throughout many societies. So some early thinkers, your book mentions Comte, systematic investigation of behavior. He's credited with coining the term sociology. Harriet Martineau really looked at social behavior in Britain and the United States, emphasized the impact of economy, law, trade, health, and population on social problems. Think about just the industrialized city. Health because lack of clean water, populations in these hugely overpopulated areas, and really the impact that people and philosophers are starting to look at in terms of what does this do to one's society, to one's relationships. Herbert Spencer talks about evolution in society, a controversial ideal. Your book mentions Emil Durkheim. He talks about being talked about, not currently living, but behavior being understood within the larger social context rather than just looking at an individual's behavior. Did not limit interest to one aspect of social behavior. So Durkheim looked at all aspects of social behavior. Nothing was very off limits, was a philosopher. Very known for looking at suicide as a study in sociology, that suicide is not, although it seems as a very individualistic act, taking one's own life, that if we look at that action across a society, we can start to see patterns that are recognizable. Max Weber, Weber said that to look and understand behavior, one must learn the subjective meaning people attach to the actions. So looking behind, what does that action really mean to the individual? Weber focused on law and economics. He wrote Economy and Society, The Protestant Ethic, Spirit of Capitalism, all things that you may sound familiar because of history classes. Then we get to Karl Marx, also a very common historical figure, not just in sociology. Marx, as many of you may know, said society was fundamentally divided between two classes that clashed in their fight for interests. He said that he believed that the economic system and social and political relationships were maintained by the power of the people who owned the capital. He worked with Engels. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. He talked about the proletariat, the working class, and he said they should really overthrow the existing class system. Like I said, he wrote the Communist Manifesto. We get to W.E.B. Du Bois. He was an early Black sociologist. He really, not obviously, but in the late 1800s, early 1900s, struggling for egalitarian society, considered knowledge essential in combating prejudice, conducted in-depth studies looking at urban life, focused on religion at the community level. Du Bois talked about a double consciousness, the division of one's individual identity into two or more social realities. Um, 20th century, more recent sociologists, we have Charles Horton Cooley, used the sociological perspective to examine face-to-face groups. Also Jane Addams, another female sociologist. She combined intellectual inquiry, social service work, and political activism. She was a co-founder of Hull House. Jane Addams is also known as being the mother, if you will, because she is a female character in this, but the mother of social work, modern social work, for her work in really looking at society and combining, disadvantaged individuals with social services at the time. And Robert Merton really combined theory and research, developed the dominant theory of dominant behavior, two separate approaches. Macro sociology, concentrate large-scale phenomenon, entire civilization, macro, big, and then micro sociology, stressing the study of small groups, often through experimental situations. So we've got macro, large, micro, tiny, small group interactions. There are two other levels of study. We have mesosociology, as you would guess, middle, meso, intermediate level of analysis, looking at the study of formal organizations and social movements. So looking at the, different social movements currently, looking at formal organizations who may be studying education or the education system, and then global sociology. So really looking at levels of analysis that can compare nations or multinational corporations and their relationships with nation states. So, major theoretical perspectives for sociology. These theoretical perspectives will try, and the goal of using them is to outline why certain forces or relationships will equate to certain outcomes and behaviors. So in the next slide, I'll discuss the three major theoretical perspectives, some of the theories that go with those, and then is a chart from the textbook that tries to lay out the similarities and differences amongst the three major theoretical perspectives. Okay, here we go. Three major theoretical perspectives of sociology. So the first one is the functionalist perspective. It emphasizes the way parts of a society are structured to maintain its stability. So functionalist perspective, society organized to maintain its stability. Now, within the functionalist perspective, there are the idea of a manifest function and a latent function. A manifest function is an open status intended function of or consequence of an aspect of a society. So the manifest function of school is for an individual to be educated. On the other hand, a latent function is the unconscious or unintended function of a social institution or social relationship. So the latent function of school is often that it is the first time where individuals realize where they are in the socioeconomic levels within their community. So it may be the first time that an individual realizes, are they part of the haves or the have-nots within their community? And that's a latent function. People don't go to school to find out, are they below the poverty line or are they considered poor in their community? They go to school to be educated. It just so happens that in those interactions, they're going to find out where they fit within that socioeconomic piece of their community. Also within the functionalist perspective are dysfunctions. A dysfunction is an element or process of a society that disrupts the social system or reduces the social system's stability. Again, using the example of school, dysfunction of school may be that gang interactions could be a dysfunction of school, right? So because school brings together people from different areas, that within itself might be creating extra tensions, and then no one can function, right? Reduces the stability of a safe learning environment. I was stretching there on that example. Okay, conflict perspective. assumes that social behavior is best understood in terms of conflict or tension between groups competing over a resource. This is the Marxist view. Conflict's part of everyday life in every society. And conflict theorists are interested in how institutions help maintain the privileges of some groups while keeping others subservient. Again, unfortunately, education can be looked at as being part of this conflict perspective, in that if you can afford to be highly educated, you are. And then if you can't afford to be highly educated, you're stuck within the same socioeconomic level that perhaps you're trying to move out of. The feminist perspective under conflict perspective is that there's inequality in gender as central to all behavior in all organization. Proponents of the feminist perspective really try to look at the larger macro level of society. They also say that it's often seen that feminist theories believe our subordination is inherent in capitalist societies. We can look at the jobs that are considered more feminine institutions. They're also typically lower paid. Elementary school teachers, caretakers, those types of jobs aren't necessarily as highly valued, even though as a society we like to say we do highly value people who are educating future generations. When it comes to monetarily paying them, especially because of these gendered occupations, we typically can see that there's often inequality in that. And then a newer theory under the conflict perspective is queer theory. It looks at the study of society from the perspective of different sexual identities. Heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. Michel Foucault is regarded what is normal or even acceptable human sexuality varies dramatically by culture and throughout time periods. And we will talk more about that when we start looking at gender roles. So on to our last perspective here. We have the interactionist perspective. Generalizes that everyday forms of social interaction explain society as a whole. It's also referred to as symbolic interactionism. Humans viewed as the living world of meaningful objects, right? So material things, actions, people, relationships, symbols. We're going to talk all about this in the upcoming weeks. But it also really looks at nonverbal communications, gestures, facial expressions, postures. We use nonverbal communication every day, and the fact that we share a common culture is what allows us to do that. You'll know if you've ever visited another culture that you were not familiar with either a facial expression or someone's hand gesture, what those nonverbal communications do for a society. And then manipulation of symbols seen in dress codes, right? We all know we have both written and formal dress codes and then informal dress codes, and when someone violates those norms, we know that it causes us some discomfort. In the interactionist perspective, we have George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman. Goffman is known for the dramaturgical approach, people seen as theatrical performers. And, you know, it's understandable to see that, I think, especially now with the rise of social media, how often people who are posting selfies or videos of themselves really are embodying the theatrical performance and the role play that they really want to be known for. So lastly, like I said, I've got the chart from the textbook. Your textbook goes into more detail on all of this. But by looking at the three major sociological frameworks, we can have a better understanding of how sociologists seek to explore social behavior. It looks at the same type of, we can take one social issue and look at it from all three perspectives, and we'll see things quite differently. And a sociological research is typically guided by the researcher's theoretical viewpoint. So if they're really a conflict theorist and they're looking at the issue of, I don't know, pick a social problem, poverty, they're really going to look at it from the point of view that everyone is fighting for the same resources. So that's table 3-1 from your textbook from chapter 1. And that's all on chapter 1's presentation.